Welcome back to Political Paradigms. It's Toby and Theo. It's budget week. There's also record migration figures. There's a lot going on. But first, to the autumn statement. Jeremy Hunt's autumn statement. Definitely a starting gun of many for the next general election. Theo, there was no need for an emergency podcast, but there was a lot of news.
There was, yes. I mean, the budget kind of flopped a little bit, and I think we're going to go into more detail about that soon, but it just seems kind of like another nail in the coffin for this government with what they've been going through recently. Do you agree?
I do agree. I certainly agree. We'll get into why, but I guess the way I would put it is politically, budget week has either been net neutral or very slightly net positive politically, but if it is net positive, it's so minimal compared to sort of the scale of the problems the government faces. It's not going to shift the dial. Quick look at the polling. We'll talk about the politics in a minute, but we were speculating about polling last week. Labour and Keir Starmer have not sustained any damage, really, from the divisions in their party last week, and the Conservatives have not sustained any significant improvement as of yet after the budget, despite various individual provisions being popular. Theo, take us through. We say the budget. It's an autumn statement. It's essentially a budget. Take us through it.
Yeah, so I think the question a lot of people are going to be asking is, does it help the Sunak government? I would say no. I mean, in my view, it was a kind of desperate attempt to manipulate and cherry pick economic data from the government to try and present some semblance of a recovering economy. But looking at the actual figures in any detail will immediately dispel this, not to mention the fact that the voters themselves are still bearing the brunt of this government's economic decisions, the ongoing crises caused by the government, the market forces, and global events. And so it'd be very hard to buy what the government's saying when your daily experience almost directly contradicts it. So some of the headlines we saw from Sunak on X, the day of the budget: biggest ever national insurance cut for workers. And then from the Daily Mail, 27 million Brits handed a £450 Christmas present. So we saw some supposedly seminal cuts to national insurance and tax brackets, but the overall backdrop really minimizes the impact of this. So the national insurance base rate was cut from 12 to 10% from January, not to mention the government's claim recently that it halved inflation from 11.1 to 4.6%. But this is not quite going to manifest as a better economic situation for the voters.
No, so the government is saying on national insurance, they are saying that will affect 28 million people, saving someone on the average salary. If you take out the tax bracket situation, which is a stealth rise, on its own, that saves someone on the average salary £450 a year. It takes effect from January. That's where the politics comes in a bit, because big move, moving it forward to January instead of the fiscal year in April, I believe. And a lot of people saying that is to leave the option open of calling an election in May. Would you concur with that?
Absolutely. I think it's obviously a political move, but I'm kind of surprised because I would almost definitely say Jeremy Hunt knows that what he's done is not as dramatic as he says, as you say yourself. The increase in wages is massively offset by the increase in inflation and also the frozen tax brackets. So these tax cuts are in fact de facto tax rises as a percentage of income due to the frozen brackets. The falling inflation is almost entirely comprised of energy prices. In fact, while they claim it's been halved, it's actually in real terms, excluding energy, which was highly affected by the Ukraine war, fallen from 6.2% to 5.6% since January. So almost nothing. So in terms of it actually being an election tool, I don't even see the rationale behind that, because unless they actually believe that they've done something great for the economy, this wouldn't actually be beneficial.
So you've got two things in tension, right? You've got the election that they're looking towards, and a lot of debate this week about when the election will be. Some people saying this budget means it's absolutely certain it will be May. Some people saying that's crazy. I think the best way of reading it is it leaves them the option of looking at May, but also they can, if they're still 20 points behind, they will wait till October or November. Absolutely. If the polls start moving, they might go earlier. growth, that is the other big sort of backdrop to this, because like I say, you're dealing with a contradiction. So you're looking towards the election and you're trying to manage your own party. The party wants tax cuts. Like me and Theo were saying last week, the government was in quite a lot of trouble, a lot of brewing discontent on the Conservative backbenchers. By making tax cuts and not doing anything that splits the Conservative coalition, all these measures will get through Parliament easily. They're keeping the party together and they're satiating some of the discontent. Wider economic backdrop, because a lot of people say, oh, the economy is going to start improving next year. Yes, but massive downgrade to those forecasts. GDP...
Yes, from the OBR, which was established by the current Foreign Secretary, so kind of ironic.
The economy will now grow by 0.6% this year and 0.7% next. That is essentially next to nothing, right, Theo, in the grander scheme of things? That is really slow growth.
Yes, arguably even a recline if you consider, or a decline if you consider the rate at which prices are going up in everything other than energy.
So would it be safe to say we're heading into an election year with stagnant economic conditions at best?
I think that's correct.
Wages and benefits, that was also interesting. Do you want to take us through that, or do you want me to go through that?
So I think the one that stood out to me the most, just to briefly mention, was this 2-year maximum period of unemployment benefits before you're cut off if you don't find employment. I think that was the highlight. Am I correct?
Yes, actually, the sort of squeeze on benefits and sort of pushing people into work, that very much did feel fitting for sort of David Cameron's return, right? It did feel like a completely out of the Cameron Osborne sort of austere playbook, trying to draw a dividing line with Labour, who now say they will back those measures and say the government should go further, so that Labour are sort of not falling into that trap, as it were. It's interesting. So you've got the punitive measure, which is basically a crackdown on certain disability benefits and such, with more work requirements. That is broadly popular. The other thing they've done, which is benefits going up with inflation and the state pension going up with inflation, which there was a debate about whether they should do that. That is also very popular. So the generous thing is very popular, and the punitive thing is very popular. The other thing I was thinking is, 2-3 months ago, the government was saying, we have no money, which wasn't strictly true. We can't spend anything. That's why we're not doing anything. Now they're going, we do have money, we've decided, and now we're going to do tax cuts and massive wage and benefit increases and a new minimum wage and all these different things. Would it be safe to say that they're just sort of, how much money the government has is how much money they decide they want to give themselves through their own sort of framework? Because it kind of changed dramatically in 3 months. The fiscal headroom thing is very loose. It's not completely accurate. And it's sort of their own arbitrary fiscal rules, right, Theo?
Yes. I mean, again, the data coming out of government agencies can be pretty much spun whichever way you want. Jeremy Hunt, picking out OBR stats that pretty much contradict the rest just to make his point. I really don't think that these politicians are specifically that motivated by how much money there actually is, more what statement is going to get them the most political traction. So essentially, it's just damage control, I'd say, at this point.
What would you say is like the single most significant thing about this autumn statement overall, if you were to look at it in a broad sweep?
I would say the most significant feature was probably the tax cuts, that, and then the actual manifestation of that policy. But that will be what stands out, I think I heard an analogy of what you were saying about it kind of ringing of David Cameron and kind of coinciding with his return. It's like someone said, when you got those teddy bears that you like squeeze and they like they say something, and then when the battery dies, it still occasionally blurts out like little phrases, and that's the same. This government just blurting out tax cuts, hard work, etc.
It is a bit like that, isn't it? Yeah. We're backing the strivers, not the skivers, or whatever it used to
exactly.
be.
The strivers, not the scroungers. I think it was.
That's the one.
Thatcher on your bike.
That's an even. Yeah, was that Norman Tebbit? I think that was a Norman Tebbit.
Something like that. Yeah.
Norman Tebbit deep cut. Yeah. So it's all that stuff. It's very political. The thing that I think is probably most significant, or in my way, sort of feels most egregious, just on and governments of all parties do this. This is not sort of a uniquely sort of, oh, this is an evil thing only the Conservatives have done. Labour did this before they lost as well. But the very deliberate, basically, the government is pricing in, saying we can afford these tax cuts on the basis that we're going to do basically 2% cuts to every government department in 2025 and 26 when we're no longer in office. And the reason they're doing this is they're doing it to say when Labour comes in, they will either have to massively raise taxes or do massive cuts, neither of which an incoming Labour government wants to do. Now, it just feels to me like complete politicization of economic policy. Not even a little bit, like one measure here or there that's political. And you as a government, you are meant to do things that are popular. Like, it's generally good if you're doing things the public like. But it's completely dishonest. I mean, you can disagree, Theo. I think it's completely dishonest to say that any government is going to actually be able to do a massive squeeze on a larger scale than the Osborne-Cameron cuts to public services. Again, I think you'd see the NHS probably in a state of collapse, and you'd see sort of the public backlash to the lack of social provision sort of doom any government that was presiding over that, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's a political measure, and it's, again, incredibly, incredibly dishonest, and it is damage control. I mean, they know they're going to be in the political wilderness. How can they make life difficult for the Labour government? What they're definitely not doing is governing in the interests of the voters and the constituents. And I think that's the part that really stands out, because, you can say what you want about their policies, but intentionally, causing fluctuations in taxes, which create all sorts of problems for employers and businesses and individuals and benefits claimants. It's, again, incredibly dishonest, and they're probably just, well, yeah, it is absolutely a political move.
Do you think Labour is worried about this trap? Because the reporting I've been reading is they're not. And the Labour approach is basically going to, again, which is also dishonest. I think we can call this out from all sides. They're basically saying, no, we are not going to raise taxes. No, we are going to do the 2 years of austerity that the government have etched in. I must emphasise, the austerity that's etched into the forecasts by the government is on a commensurate scale to what George Osborne and David Cameron did. Again, on top of it. And Labour's saying, no, we will do that. We will not spend any more money on public services. We will not raise any taxes. That also feels completely dishonest, because I don't think a Labour government could internally survive doing that without the party sort of throwing out the leader. No? I can't... I don't even think the Conservatives could get some of those cuts through Parliament. I certainly don't think a Labour government could, no matter what its majority. If the Conservatives did this, they'd be turfed out. If they somehow win and implemented these cuts, they'd be turfed out, because they'd be the government that killed the NHS if they do like a 2% budget cut to it or something. Considering even during austerity, it did, spending did rise on certain areas of the budget. And then if Labour do it, obviously they've not done what voters expect of a Labour government, which is improve public services. So, Theo, do you think both parties are sort of engaging in a complete political fiscal delusion that we'll find out what they're actually going to do after the election?
I mean, politically speaking, it sounds like, the Conservatives are pulling this dirty trick, and Labour have to pull a dirty trick in response. I think, honestly, again, with the kind of taking a holistic view of every party's electoral fortunes, Labour can probably afford to make a few campaign promises that don't quite hold up. I mean, Boris Johnson calling Jeremy Corbyn a Stalinist for proposing a certain tax level and then hiking them above that level during the COVID pandemic. Not the biggest dent to his popularity. And I will also add about austerity measures. I'm not too sure exactly the nature of them, but it's worth noting a lot of Cameron's austerity measures were kind of stealthily ushered in. They weren't direct, like a lot of them were, but a lot of them weren't just Parliament's going to cut this by that. It was, they started with ring fencing, then they set up the OBR, and then they slowly gave the OBR more and more power over funding levels, and a lot of it was quite stealthy and calculated. So I think, with the state the economy's been in, unless the austerity measures are huge and widely publicised by being massive acts of parliament, it wouldn't be too damaging for Labour.
Okay, I've got some figures up here. So Jeremy Hunt's fiscal headroom of £13 billion, which is what he's sort of saying allowed him to do these tax cuts, is predicated on real terms cuts of £19.1 billion to departmental budgets and a rise in fuel duty that will never happen. Unprotected departments would see real per-person spending cut by 14%, an austerity programme that would be more painful than George Osborne's because there is no obvious fat to cut after the last decade. So I just can't see that happening. So if we say that is going to happen, then that's what Labour will do. If we say that's not going to happen, then we don't know what the Tories would do in their they're re-elected, what would it be, fifth term? In their fifth term, and we don't know what Labour will do in their first. So it's a complete mystery. How do you think Labour will square this circle once they actually come into office? Do you think they'll eventually, after winning, go, okay, here are some tax rises that are pretty popular, we're just going to have to do these?
Yeah, I can imagine them doing that. I mean, I feel like one theme of this budget is that they're trying to kind of win back, I think what they call I think it's finance belt voters or something.
Is this a thing?
What's
Is
the
that
word?
a thing? Finance?
Yeah, it's like liberal Lib Dem Tory, like, high tax bracket voters. Was it
Are they the ones that
Pretty Belt or something?
they might do? Property belt maybe. I have heard.
Property Belt, something like that. And those are the ones who like the fiscal responsibility.
Are these the
and
ones that are called, like, you call them established liberals? They're quite Remainy, but they also like austerity and sort of
yeah, exactly, like neoliberals, basically.
the neoliberal portion of the electorate.
Essentially.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to rule out the possibility that this is quite literally just a simple proposal to win back those voters. I mean,
Yeah.
actually passing austerity measures of that size through Parliament, unless the public sees it as the right measure, which I don't think they would, given the way the last set of austerity measures went or appeared to go, at least.
Yeah. And I saw some interesting public attitudes polling, which would have been very different in 2010, and it was like, which is closer to your view? The government has a limited amount of money to spend, or the government can spend whatever money it wants if it chooses to, and the chooses to thing had like a 50% support. So I think people's view of what the government can spend has been shifted, I'm assuming, by the pandemic. That's presumably what has sort of changed expectations.
So they kind of saw the level of spending in the pandemic and thought, yeah, this is something we can carry on.
I think it's sort of I think people have come to a conclusion of, like, the government, if it wants to prioritize more money on public services, they can find a way to do it, rather than that's completely impossible, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I suppose so. And it's also very hard to tell. The economy it's a complex thing. Even the government often struggles to grapple with the various forces at play. It's hard to tell what is resulting from what. Like, did the government COVID measures, potentially lead to a lot of the problems we're seeing today? It's very hard to know.
Yeah, it's one of those things that we'll still be reading, well, we will, because we're saddos, be reading papers about in like 2035, the fiscal aftermath of the COVID pandemic.
People will be answering A-level economics questions. To what extent did the COVID measures cause the austerity fallout for 2020?
What was the macroeconomic fallout of Eat Out to Help Out in the summer of 2020, etc., etc. So Labour, here's my take on the Labour sort of trap being laid for Labour is the government wants to do what they did in 1992, which is they did a budget right before the election. This is why some people think they might do a quick early March budget, call the election, more tax giveaways, and also going, Labour don't have an answer to these things. They'll have to either reverse them or do this unpopular thing or that unpopular thing. Labour vacillated in 92 and also said, okay, we'll raise taxes in response to this budget, and they sort of very narrowly lost. So I think the government wants to recreate that, but the fallback to all this is, back then the Tories still had an advantage on economic competence. Right now Labour maintains a clear advantage on economic competence. They retain, so far, this could change if the Tories keep cutting taxes, I don't know, an advantage on which party promises lower taxes, and they retain, this is all in public data surveys, YouGov, Redfield and Wilton, other pollsters, they maintain an advantage on the economy, as I say, and they maintain a 20 to 21 point lead in the opinion polls, as opposed to like the 5%, 3% lead that they had in the spring of 92. So I think it's, again, you could look at this as a genius way of stopping Labour winning and damaging them. As Theo says, they can afford to make mistakes. This is much more laying traps for them once they come into office. So essentially, Rachel Reeves is going to walk into the Treasury and a load of fiscal grenades left by Jeremy Hunt are going to sort of go off. It's going to be a baptism of fire.
And maybe even a note saying there's no money left again.
Which Keir Starmer will brandish at PMQs in 2035 as a reason as to not... you can never trust them with our money again, or whatever. Yeah, can you imagine? It's just like the last 10 years in reverse. Should we talk about... Is there anything else you want to say on budget, Theo, or do you want to move to the migration figures?
I think we've thoroughly picked it apart, I'm happy to say.
Yeah, we weren't too kind to it, were we?
Yeah.
Okay, so... record migration figures. Net migration, which is the difference between the number of people coming to live in the UK and those leaving, last year was a record 745,000. This flies in the face of promises from consecutive Conservative governments. It continues to go up. This single set of figures is probably an exception. And it's important to remember we took people in from Hong Kong. That was exceptional. We've taken people in from Ukraine. That was exceptional. We've taken in people from Afghanistan. That was exceptional. So this isn't just day to day. But it's also important to say the economy has basically been propped up post-Brexit on, yes, a slight reduction in EU migration, but a massive increase in non-EU migration. And that's been filling a lot of vacancies in the economy. And that's sort of how the government's kept economic growth relatively robust. By robust, I mean not flat on its arse, you know, slightly above water. And there's now a big battle in the Conservative Party, really, because the public, in terms of polling, really want lower migration, illegal and legal. Lots of the Conservative Party do, obviously the right, but also the majority of Conservative MPs are not happy about this. The Conservatives also risk, you know, if Nigel Farage comes out of the jungle, starts leading reform again, you know, big problem, completely seals the fate of the Tories. And this issue is the third most important issue to Conservative voters. And it's not to Labour voters. So this is very much hurting the Tories among their base. And at the same time, the government kind of doesn't want to stop some of this because it's helping prop up the economy. So Jeremy Hunt would probably say, this is fine. We like these work visas. We want to keep this going. Theo, is this a square that Number 10 can circle in time for next year?
I mean, it is kind of in keeping with the message we got about, well, from the budget, if you look into it, the Tories are losing at their own, I suppose, big issues, overseeing such large amounts of migration and illegal migration. I mean, I'm not surprised that it's something that's, you know, losing them on with voters, but also, you know, if the moderate part of the party are also saying that this is something that needs to be curbed, I mean, it should kind of be a cross-party issue. I mean, there's no denying that people entering on small boats is dangerous and just not the right way to be processing migration, regardless of what you think about the levels of migration that should be allowed into the country. But again, it's just another one of their big issues that they're in fact performing worse on, and one of the things that we've consistently said are causing their large unpopularity, I would say.
This is it. And the small boats thing is sort of one of the things where there's a degree of both parties are very happy to say this needs to stop. The legal migration thing, which is obviously the majority of these numbers is legal migration, it's not illegal, is the other big problem, because the government isn't really doing anything to reduce legal migration in a meaningful way. There are certain bits of it that are unpopular that they can go, oh, this individual policy can be tweaked here or there. But actually, you know, economists would say, and people in the Treasury would say, no, we don't want a dramatic reduction in legal migration. It's kind of keeping things afloat. And Labour will have a big issue with this if they come into power, when they come into power. The Conservatives are dealing with it now. There is sort of a thing of the Conservatives have increased the salience of this for years. In opposition under Labour, they hammered on about migration, legal migration being too high. In government, they kept promising to lower it, and during their tenure in office, it's continued to go up. And my suspicion would be the Conservative Party have in part stoked a lot of the strong public feeling on this over the years, and now they're dealing with a public that has been promised lower migration and has continually got increasing migration. And I don't know about what you think, Theo, but I think that probably is like fatally damaging to their own credibility in ways that they'll be reckoning with once they're in opposition.
Yeah, there's no denying that it was many in the Tory party who sowed much of this discontent, about migration. I mean, we're seeing all these, images of people coming over on small boats, but it's a small fraction of the actual migration that we're seeing. And what's kind of ironic is that, Brexit was supposed to be, a measure to completely curb migration and give us more control. And what it did do was decrease migration from the EU, which many, well, I'm not going to say many, but a good number of Brexit supporters were against. But I don't think you can't really deny that there is probably a racial element to it, that certain types of immigration are less popular with many of Brexit voters, and that's actually increased as a result. So it's again completely blown up in their face, this policy and their whole approach to it, and they very much did contribute to stoking division about migration. I mean, there's just no denying it, and also giving a platform to Nigel Farage in the Brexit referendum and the 2019 referendum. I mean, if they hadn't determined some of their policies, because they were losing popularity and voters to him, who knows if he would still be as high profile as he was back then. And he's undeniably led the charge against all forms of migration for the last 10 years.
Yeah, and this is ongoing, and we'll see what happens. But it is there is a lot of sort of pundits say things to the extent of attitudes to immigration have actually got much better since Brexit. They are much more liberal than they were 10 years ago or so. The public is, less anti-immigration. They are more open to hearing about the benefits of immigration if you look at data. But the other fact is a majority of the British public think it is too high, and that includes legal and illegal. It's not just the small boats, and policymakers are obviously looking at that, and there's a tension. And, if you present the case of an individual person's situation, people are very sympathetic. If you show people the numbers overall, they are not. It's very nuanced, very complicated, and I think both sides are dishonest with sort of public opinion. So, people who are pro-migration will go, actually, people are completely fine with these levels of migration. They're not. But then people who are very much on the other side will go, the British public is, frothing at the mouth for sort of massive draconian measures. It's also not true to such an extent. Public opinion is nuanced, and you kind of need political leaders to shape it, really, on things like this, rather than just getting people angrier without offering any solution, because that is very damaging to trust. If you're saying, I'm going to deal with this problem, I'm going to deal with it, I'm going to deal with it, this is a big problem, I'm going to deal with it, and then you don't, people are obviously going to lose faith in the political process and possibly become more extreme.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And similar to the budget figures, a lot of people's views about immigration are going to be determined by how the government chooses to frame it. Are they framing it as all these hundreds of thousands of people, all of them are coming over on small boats? That's obviously going to sow a lot more discontent than, if everyone's given an accurate, nuanced view of the actual, a nuanced breakdown of the immigration figures. It's very much a publicity thing as well.
Exactly, entirely. Following up towards the end of the pod, few things coming in the next week. The few things have been reported on through the week, this week as well. The government is apparently getting on an election footing from the 1st of January next year. So that doesn't mean it's coming early, but from the 1st of January 2024, the government is going to be in full election mode. In the months to come, the next couple of months, in the new year, Labour is probably going to begin their talks with the civil service, sort of negotiating the settlement for when they come into government. If they come into government, those talks will be authorised relatively soon. And then we've got, I guess, the next big event is the budget, which is supposedly in March. More tax cuts would be my guess. Another, if we thought there were some mini traps for Labour, they'll go all out and try and set some big traps. And I think the date of the election is going to be determined by how the Conservatives are polling in, say, February. Because it's been reported February is when when Sunak is going to make a decision. He's open to May. He's open to October or November. If they're still polling as bad as they are now in February or March, there won't be an early election. If they've narrowed it a bit and then the budget goes well, maybe they'll call it early. I don't know if you have any guesses or preferences, Theo, but does that all sound pretty accurate to you?
Yes, it does. If what you say is true, that he's going to assess the situation in February, and if it's not great, push it back as far as he can. I'd say he's probably going to push it back because even the predicted statistics about the economy don't bode well, and they have not been shown to be entirely accurate by this autumn statement. So I'd probably err on the side of a later election, but I still don't think that would give them much of an advantage at all.
No, considering as well, they're probably still going to not have stopped the small boats, and that will be happening over the summer months.
Yes.
But then if you do it near winter, you've got an NHS crisis. So it's like, I suppose the best...
The seasonal events of politics.
Yeah, the seasonal... Exactly. You've got a different kind of crisis depending on the month. I suppose you could...
Well, I think probably a small boats crisis in the summer allows for more culture war stirring and a more cultural based election. So, and
also, like, a collapsing NHS is more damaging than the small boats politically. I know some people don't think that. I think that the health service is if you were to ask voters what's more important, they'd probably say the health service.
Yes.
But yeah, it's all about the fundamentals. They're in a lot of trouble. We'll see. I'm going on holiday, so if we're doing a pod in the next week, are we going to basically reverse roles, Theo? So I'm down the line from abroad, and you're going to be sort of at base camp.
Sure, sounds good to me. I'll introduce the next pod.
Yeah, exactly. You know what? That's what will happen. Maybe nothing will happen. Are you still as sanguine on the sort of position of Sunak, or do you think he's secured his leadership for now?
I think he weathered the storm, the Braverman storm. She kind of fell flat a little bit. I think she expected a huge part of the party to break away with her. It didn't happen. So I think, he'll most likely lead his party into the next election. I still maintain that election will go horribly for the Tories in light of everything that's happened and despite the few good developments for them. But Sunak certainly weathered that storm, I would say.
Yes, I did. Another theory in the Times, which was reported, is apparently Sunak thinks if he's polling to a 10-point gap, so instead of a 20-point lead, it's a 10-point Labour lead, they can call the election in May and he can fight it out to a hung parliament, stay leader, Labour will form a government, and then there'll be another election in like a year and they can win that election. Does that sound like copium? That sounds like copium to me.
It's a little bit copium to me, but if you have 1 year of Labour leading a hung parliament minority government, everything that goes wrong in that could easily just flip the fortunes of the parties, with the kind of generally the attention span people have when they tend to vote. But I think, again, it's reaching. It really is wishful thinking.
It's the idea that this hung parliament is not on the cards right now. A lot needs to go wrong for Labour to get to that stage.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, Theo, thank you for joining me, and I'll hear from you, if not in the next week, in the next week and a little bit more. See you then.
Thank you. Travel safe.